Collide in the For Honor Lore. Welcome back to part 2 of For Honor Lore Explained. I'm your host, Amon Ra, the gamer himself. That don't mind I also slide man himself. But for the record, again, this is a continuation to the other part of lore. If you want to go and get a full fresh recap on the 5 main factors for how For Honor Lore came to be at the start, then go and watch that. This is talking about the collide that will manifest after another case stuff. We're getting right into it, no intro, just set in stone. And the collide of the For Honor world is the same of the 3 original mainline factions: the Knights of Ashveld, Vikings of Valkenheim, and the Samurai of the Mire. The setup and the structure in the sense of the timing and the course within the time, for obviously the characters coming together and other form of things like that, was in the setup of being what was the point and place for why characters went about different form of fighting, the casualties, the bigger case of things manifested, and bigger crit, these form stuff that popped off in that sense, the timing. In the mix of all of this, different characters that come from all 3 factions will pop in to go ahead and make new means within the individual form factions, with the case of the samurai putting together their entire empire in full, pledging to a great tumultual form samurai code, like a form of how they would in general within the sense of the different parts of the clans, different tides within the empire. The Vikings have a multiple case of different clans within the case of the Warborn clan being the main clan we see within the case of the Viking story mode in the film of chapter 2. And then you have the Ironstone Legion, the Blackstone Legion, the empire that most likely is in the form of baseness for where the Vikings got some of their things from raiding, and the same time evolving the obviously Roman boys, the Roman knights in the sense for the Roman centurion and gladiators sticking their heads out, and different sense being the main place of why things did this and this for the place of the time. So if you want to know about the different colliding things that came in that sense, that's what would happen. But then in the midst of all the sense of war that came with all these different people coming together, especially in the sense of new form allies coming together and different form instance of ideals, especially again within the different colliding regions, there would be also amidst a different form of war that would bring out different people, especially in the form of Apollyon and other form warriors that need to come together to go ahead and fight for different means. These instances of wars would not pack the bigger case of different people until they would come, but the only other substance matter involving how this war striked or did anything in the bigger sense was in the same sense of the Roman boys in the case of their empire sitting in probably long out from the case from where Ashveld is, and brought out bigger brothel things to come with them as well, because obviously the empire and what it held as an entire case of engravement into the bigger form of the war and evolving different Roman warriors, their culture, and the fact that as a species war builds us up, that would correspond to what happened there in that setting pretty much. And all around in the sense of the war and conflict, it would just be sheer what do we do this and how in a sense are we gonna do, you know what I'm saying? It was all around a big mix up with the timing for how the form of the warriors fought and did things in this time. As you see in the game, it's mixed form territories and people doing this and doing that, which does not define how the game is, but a little bit of a obviously terrible form of writing, prompt of moving with things in the sense of writing. Obviously, some cases of your characters tie into the case of the game with your characters representing whoever you want, and you're able to write the sayings of the lore. This doesn't actually mean full lore, but some parts that are legit just fanfic within the For Honor lore became canon. So in this collide, this also will come in the collide of you trying to manifest or make whatever instance of your own creation, simply put, just because it exists there and things along those lines. Because simply put, you make up your own form of lore and it does this and this in your own means, in your own right. Regions of the land. New stage, a different form of galas and different correspondence to things like I said within a collide would happen, but it would stretch out new form means. Within Ashveld, we would bring out different form of warriors, like I've already said, with how the knights were built up in different stances to start with people. The big heavy hitters and people that would come in the same sense would be the colliding conflict within people pushing to do this, territory within the knights, and how their people made up different means, and how they were going to do stuff in their moral code, and things along those lines. In the mix of the moral code, it would be staging new means for peace. Within the wardens, the lawbringers bringing justice to the injustice, and more the case of the chaos that have brung out. The generals, in a form of valor and form of soldiers and fighters, would fight in defense against all these insane things. The Vikings would be boarding multi form of places within Raven in the case of the war-bound sense that they were. The Raven clan would be struck down of its glory and would have to rise up within the case of the Vikings chapter 2, so that's why they didn't pick up on the same sense as what they did in the form of the fight that came, like they did later on in the chapter, which is why you see the upbringing of a new form of clan. With that being said, the Vikings again, big Raven, big pillaging, big dominating, would leave a stain of fear across Asveld, and that would be the main conflict. The samurai would stay in the mire and not leave, and would not have any big spreading form conflict, and would never even be seen the same way, which is why they've been the most passive and very just calm stance since the people not trying to fight, as the samurai again already went through a great clash in the same sense of what they went through over in Japan. Not in the form of a war sense, but went through a great traumatic event in the sense of Japan being destroyed and struck with a great case of mirage of different things that they could not go and face. And so getting into another fight, even after they came out from a mental warfare like saying something like that, probably put them in the mindset to stay passive, and if war came to them, they would have the greatest means of defense and offense strong enough to face them, which is why when the Vikings set sight across the sea and push after the samurai, they already have a big fort built up in case of that, and have been having their people train and be ready for a sense of conflict to come in that type of way, because again, they went out for a great traumatic event, they went through a great cataclysm, their people were struck with a great sense of devastation, and so being put through a great striking mirage of things they could not even fight, they probably want to stay out of a war-bound sense of fighting. So that's the reason why, in case you're ever wondering why the samurai don't push out as much as they did at that time, at least, that's the reason why. Then when it came down to other people, not that much would be indirectly said, but to touch a little bit on them, mainly in the same sense for Wulin, as they are our fourth faction and what they hold a voice of, being with in the same sense, is simply that in the wars that was bringing more sense of despair, chaos, and politic diffusion and abrupt form of different out-of-pocket parties in the mix of it, it would literally just bring in new sound for different warriors to come into play and to start their own bringing the things, like Jing Jun retiring, coming different rests, new sense of the secret, and people having the capability to learn different things from the Shaolin and the form of spells or capabilities brought out, and a very peaceful region in the part of China would be brought into form. And in the case of the war diffusion and big stances of things, there would be a shred of goodness in it, but it would be too strikingly bad in some cases to where poor means would end up being the definement of what China was like, as there was no peace to be seen, there was no hearing of greater means, and the form of some people, like in the same sense of like Nuxia, would train herself in the case of her cross swords and be pushing to be the best case of dancer and animate in her own right, but in fortune sense her master and other case of people that she cared about in the midst of the lore that she has would be killed, and she would set on the site of vengeance, but that would brew at a whole different sense of point, and that would be one of the bigger sparks for things. But then people, like in the sense of the female Tiandi, which I forgot her name in the sense of the counting here, if I find her name, I will go ahead and put it in the same sense of the top part, of the top right, that you probably see right now of the video screen. So go peek into her lore if you want to go get a better mix. I'm going to go ahead and touch on her when we get into the Marching Fire / bigger overarching lore of the Wulin, as I don't want to go and give a full talk because it's going to help if I conclude it all together / compound it together with the other form of information. I'm telling you, there's going to be some bussin' lore to be shown, because right now we're talking about the good stand of what the lore is overarchingly right now. But overall, if we're talking about the sense of what the lore is and how it brings this and this to, in comparison, the people of all these regions is more broad form, bigger case stuff that would spark new means for the people in the goodness, but also reign of unfortunate saints of terror and unfortunism in the case of the world that these people live in, as in the case of Tiandi and the Meltiandi. They would all be in some way betrayed / insane sense of dishonor coming to them, with people thinking that the female Tiandi had something to do with the murder of her empress in a sane sense, and then Tiandi and his royal family and being a prince to a bigger higher form emperor, which is not indirectly said which point in time it is. But I would take a guess that in this same instance, the Empress in this same instance is a different take of time within the female Tiandi, and she founded the Wulin. And the same instance when Tiandi had something to do within the same instance of the divide of the empire, mainly in the scuffle because of the case of the royal family being killed and multi-rack of political unfortunateness and destructive that happened in the case of China boiling to a new same instance, you know what I'm saying? Because I'll obviously a war built out because of the civil discourse, dummy unfortunism, and multi-wreckage brought upon in the world. He, in the form what he did to spark that, was the fact that Tiandi was selfish, callous, lustful for saying power, and in the midst of night, he slaughtered his entire family to go ahead and reach power. But after looking over it, he felt disgusted and now punished himself mentally and spiritually and dooms himself as a scarred warrior that only punishes people in his eyes, put the same form of anger out to him to go and kill. Pretty much, simply put, he kills people that are of a dishonor sense, are unjust, and he kills them as an injustice form anti-hero punisher for the Wulin, and slaughters people in the same instance of bad to feel more of the fire to keep fighting, as that's the only thing he knows in this precaution. There's going to be a lot more export and precaution of why he does what he does, his lore, the foundation of what he does, things like that, but he overarchingly doesn't have a bigger and point and play for why he does what he does in the same sense. It's simply just him doing that sparked this, and then the road for the Wulin come into play. Again, it's not the best set in stone for when it all pours into play, but that's most likely what pure form of lore was for the Wulin at this time, because simply put, the case of when the regions went into their different debacles and the mainline fight and playing field, and then what happened in China wasn't the best served, and it kind of is weird for how it pours into the resistance of conflict at this time. But those are the two defining case things that happen within the region to make that be something to be worried about if you want to know about what correlated from the conflict here that now kind of has a similarity with China in comparison. As again, I will more probably explain when the time comes involving the marching fire. But besides that, let's go ahead and get into the first stage boomingness of the actual conflict. First stage, in the bigger case of glory for different factions, for a different point of enemies. What I mean by this, in the same sense, for different case people standing for different things in the conflict of the war, with different form of warriors running around, different codes and form of things for them will correspond in new cutthroat strife for different things. Like I said, in the mix of conflict, there will be some little partial singing of peace, but multiple of the warriors did not care for that. As you see, in the mix of the spark of these different form of wars, barbaric form warriors will come from the Vikings and strive hard, and in the peril of death and despair, the knights will come all the stops to go and take them out. There's a possible case relation to form for how some of the Vikings had different armor and different sense of things they took in for different form of people of this time, as it's not a pocket for Vikings to have the same armor if you go by historical accuracy, but it is a reasonable case of theory that why some of them look the way they do or align with some case of their armor is because of the multi-pillaging and stealing from the case of knights and people like them in the case of their villages, town, and the cities come from that. As a warlord has a form of a weapon that kind of looks like a gladius and not a general form Viking sword. It's kind of mixed like it, but it's not a general, like, depending on the same sense of the time period, like a great sword, but in the means of like a little plick, boom, right, set hand sword, you know what I'm saying? It's just kind of mildly off base of what you would think a general Viking sword would be like, especially for warlord in this case. And then other instances of the first stages would be the Vikings push on different means, but then getting killed and taken out here and there. And then the first stage would also come great form warlords and different people that would make new means for the Vikings, like in the case of Guðmundur. A powerful chieftain to the Vikings, lived like a king in comparison to them, mastered the capability of taming wolves, was a beast, did different cool things, and in the mix of all same instances of his triumph, he would go ahead and become a great A legend to the people, until eventually having to go ahead and fight the Blackstone Legion, but that's for another time. Samurai, the Emperor, the great samurai shogun, a form of a great A king in a dynasty of legacy that he had, would live a great legend to the samurai, and no one dared to oppose him. Everybody respected him. There's not that much said about him, but possibly because of the way things were like over in Japan and respect and legacy that he hold, he would become their new case of emperor slash king to them because of the great staple of greatness that he would bring onto the people, and his reign of not necessarily terror, but in its sense in the tower of goodness and greatness for his people would stand beyond anyone else. So that's the best thing you can say about the Emperor. Now, the Emperor eventually, through different form of context, is not the best said, as it's just a little sense of saying, would eventually disagree with what the Orochi said, and Orochi would speak out of turn, aka the Emperor's champion. And so, he would have her or he, depending on the sense of gender you would pick for the Emperor's champion. I personally picked a female. Would go ahead and be sent into exile slash in a sense imprisonment, and has been in the prison for a different statement for years on end. And so in the mix of being in prison, in different sense of conflict will brew within the samurai, not in the full sense, but more like divide them on some stretches. And in the mix of being the Emperor's champion, being a great warrior, the Emperor's champion would grace friends like no others that are the W form friends that you wish that you had at your lunch table in high school. And even though the Emperor had never showcased great sense of terror, nobody full questioned him in the mix, and it took them having to go ahead and get siege at the front gate to actually free this person, which again could have been a pure fact that they're loyal, and he got a great tower, obviously power instead of something else, and wasn't the same sense of tick-tock ballistic form power that the Vikings had, or a reign of different territory and expansion like the Knights in the form of the Romans, or where the form, but he record multi-sense of high respect from the counts of different form of people, and the samurai all in general hold an emperor's standpoint as something beyond comprehension because of how much power that stands as, that stands as something that no man, no woman in a general high end could even process because of how much pull of power he was popping off with. He was taking all different form of what people had for different form of samurai and making something out of it without even needing to really stretch his arms, if you know what I mean. Like, he had something beyond what the general person could bring as a general emperor, but to the samurai, that was something else. That was pure, by definition, a man of high standpoint. The case of her friends would be Aya, the daimyo, Kuma, Big Brock Shigoki, and then Momiji, the great Nobushi. Her form of great skill, or in the same instance of prowess, would be in the case of comparable to Tozen, like I said, master, the form of Kaoshin, magic, and at the same time saying it's the art of skill, which in the case of her skill, not just like proud how she moved things technically different, as we don't know if it's great power skill or it's about how they did things in comparison or something else, but it seems by just Tozen's word and the fact that Tozen really made, depending on the player, Raider work to fight and was even pit for pit with his skill, showcases that, which then by scaling would probably have Raider even or even damn near have the capability to match the Emperor's champion in full skill. With that being said, so yeah, pretty much dead form being the best instance of a warrior standpoint in comparison because of how much of a form of work that character in the form of a Raider needed to do. But with all that being said, that's pretty much it for the bigger instance of things in the case of the lore coming together. Now it's time for the second spark of conflict, the conflict that would brew to emerge new sense of people, and most importantly, the main villain of For Honor, the truest form of conflict incarnate. And the second spark of conflict, be multi-running things, Typical for the case. So again, it's like a spark, and there's just a little shed of different things tied together in this, so you guys get a better feel for how this stuff brought them together. But in this, we're actually gonna talk about some serious, bigger growth when it comes down to characters and movement of things, and how things are bubbling, and the conflict, and most importantly, just important characters. So for starters, when it came down to the Vikings running up to them villages, this would affect one person, Apollyon. A little girl who saw a village get ravaged and ran by Vikings. And in the far distance, she saw a lawbringer who was supposed to stand up for justice and stand for the people who can't defend themselves. With a bunch of different men, but as a coward, stood back like a sheep and didn't go and help his brothers and sisters in need. Her people were slaughtered, killed, ran of their stuff, and unfortunately that destruction will leave a big mark on her, a big scar mentally, and push her down the road of being a vengeful spirit in the form of a wolf among the ashes, became a conqueror amongst the conquerors. You know what I'm saying? She became Apollyon, who she is now. But how she came up is this. Apollyon was coming up as a form of a person that came a warden, was in a new sense of build and type of form person to be fighting in different form ways, because of the fact of her pretentiousness, her unneeded means to go ahead and be the best in cutthroat kill. You know what I'm saying? She was under Damon Anderson, street fighting, being a mercenary, getting different form of advantages and skill, because Saints are taking on multi different groups of people along her way. You know what I'm saying? And in the mix of, again, these multi-course of different people in the mix of battle, she would rise up for the ranks, being a very inanimate form warden with a very ambidextrous stance to the style, and at the same time have a more tainted stand up for something. And in the mix of this, she would meet the lawbringer, that coward that was being a sheep, and again, regarding her stance and the scarring, would build her to start to be a great conqueroress in a sense among the conquest form of what a warden in this sense that she thought would stand for. Disregarding all the former general warden feel fighting dirty and moving different type of ways, she felt like she started to hold different means and morale the means of being full-fledged war. And so she faced the lawbringer, made him bow to her knees, beat him damn near half to death in different accounts, and killed him in the streets and showcased his head to everybody, taking scraps of the lawbringer armor, making up the armor she has now, which is why she has a Darth Vader type of cow, type of very terror form, fear striking feel. She has a very demonic state of look, and when you hear her name, when you see her, she brings great fear to you, because that is a pin state of death feeling that you will never feel the same before. Okay, and as such, when you see her, when you see that stance, the vengeful feeling, you feel get a reckon of what it means to be diabolical terror full and through. Her character really spreads out more and more as a person to be feared and person to be met with nothing but a same sense of high order and love in the same sense, because simply put, if you fuck around, you will go ahead and find out what true terror is full and through, as she's not a person to be messed with. That is a bad bitch by definition. She has Blacker Force energy, cornerstone sense, delivering it to you in full, of being somebody you not fuck with full and through. Like, is this something that you cannot even imagine in the same sense of fear in the form of verbally saying, but to people around her, she was something else. Even her enemies obviously feared her, but it was some cases where it was just a confusion because of how ridiculously weird in the sense for how she went about trying to prove a point and defend her people was like it was just a mix of weird form of purpose stick with another sense of like, damn, she really has that conflicting vibe, and she would reckon that in full, eventually splitting off from the Iron Sword Legion or whatever form of legions to come and making her own legion, the Blackstone Legion, a brutacious organization of knights that would go about things to build up other people in the mind of Apollyon, and would be joined by her own mainline knights, her own enforcers in this case, like in the same sense of a Jedi, within the same sense of having to deal with warriors that embarked on things for the mainline means of their case of commander slash their case of master in the form of Apollyon being like Darth Vader. These people would be like the case of inquisitors slash inform people in the case of the empire. But in this instance will be people that strongly believe in the full case of means and not just one pinching on the person's throat and just making them do cutthroat things. The Black Priors would be forming the people that would strongly do what they do and unleash full darkness and live by war bonds in any field, and will be a terror in the midst of battle. So unlike Holden Cross, who declined his demon name as possibly strongly believing his form of, depending on that counts, because it's been kind of slight retcon in the Christian form belief and striking to go ahead and do things on the means of, again, killing in the form of war, in the same time in the midst of doing things on a greater overarching scale. As again, you have to realize this is a man that had at one point form of Christian values, but in the form of that sense just disregarded it for Apollyon, as he said himself, which we can go ahead and play there and point that he didn't want to go start war all in full. But Apollyon will push to go and make this be the mainline standpoint of what they live for. And so in the Ironstone Legion's case of comparison, it was just strong order and peace. Blackstone Legion breathe on being pillars of might and brutaliousness and being full-fledged monsters in the midst of war, and will beckon new means for themselves and others through the strength of conflict in this case. And so now, getting into the second spark conflict and the reason why it is what it is and why you will see things being the way it is, we need to go ahead and start explaining who Apollyon is in full, which I'm just going to do simply here. Apollyon's ideals stand as she saw despair, destruction, and vile fortunate means happen to her people because of cowardness. She pleads slash proudly believes that in the same sense of war, strength will come. It has been a gruesome and is the defining means of what we are as a species. We live through war, and without war we will downgrade back in the same sense of feeble weaklings. Again, she saw destruction of a village, she saw it getting ravaged, she saw it getting wrecked, and she wringed out the greatest things in the strength possible, became a wolf, became a predator, became the queen of the herd and everything, has a standpoint beyond measurement. And in the mix of war, in the mix of destruction, the strongest will thrive, the conquerors over the conquered, only the strong will survive, having the same place of ideals like in the case of Doomfist from Overwatch, Senator Armstrong, the same instance of someone like Thanos from the MCU in Pacific, and other former people, the general mish. But unlike some of them, even though it's mainly former Doomfist, they don't have a strong sense of why they do what they do in the bigger Cornerstone. She has a whole gate laid out in the fence for why she does what she does, which in this case is to push other people in her same circumstance to be stronger than ever and be stone cold, even in the fortunate states of tragedy trickling down their spine in the same instance, to make the strongest of the strong. And that is why Apollyon, in my opinion, is the greatest next to Saint of Vaz and others representation of what the protagonist has to go against but still become to full-fledged be the greatest in the sense of the story. She is one of my favorite villains, a top 10 villain of all fiction, a dummy cool villain. I think she's one of the dopest sense of villains created by Ubisoft / put together. Shout out to the voice actors, shout out to everybody that compound together to put together a great character, which is a mash, a bunch of cool stuff. And all around, her delivery in the same system she stands for is something to be heard throughout the ages. As full, set, and through in her own words, war is what she is, and you cannot stop it. So, that gives the case of her part 2 conclusion, but when we get into the third one, this is going to be everything that's set in stone from the jump and the course, and tied with the fourth probably going to be the greatest bits of lore we have ever gotten, and it's unfortunate to see where For Honor would go, but it is a good one flowing through. Hope you guys will go and enjoy. Let's go ahead and get into the next one when the time comes. But before we're going to end this, I just want to say again, I appreciate you guys for watching, supporting. Please remember that this is all going to be followed up in one. I'm not going to cram together this entire form of multi-case parts. It's going to be all different parts flowing through, and I hope you guys will enjoy when the full time comes in the same sense. I love y'all. I can't wait to go see you guys in the next one. Peace out, Army. Love y'all.